Have our fascinating tales of everyday people from the past inspired you to explore your own family story? This episode is brought to you by findmypast.co.uk, the perfect place to start building your family tree for free. It makes it so easy to get started with just a few details and helps you fill in the gaps from there. Their smart hints do the hard work for you, instantly unearthing clues to your past from their vast record collections. You can search other members' family trees to make new connections and even share your discoveries with loved ones as your family tree grows. In just a few minutes, you'll have a flourishing family tree full of incredible stories and revelations. Visit findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime to start your family tree with a free trial. That's findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime. Free trial auto renews after 7 days unless canceled. Terms and conditions apply. This calamity was so sensible to the whole nation that the Honourable House of Commons voted an address to Her Majesty that care might be taken to supply the present necessities of the widows and orphans of such seamen cast away in this storm. The Queen likewise caused a form of prayer to be read in all churches and chapels in divine service, morning and evening, to humble ourselves under the almighty hand of God, with all low humility, to own this as a judgment of our sins, and to move us to a true sense of it, that we may amend our lives, that we may no more despise his chastisements, disobey his laws, or abuse his goodness and forbearance, lest a worse thing come unto us. Now that, David, is a rather chilling account of the mood in England in the last weeks of 1703, the weeks after one of the greatest natural disasters in English history, the Great Storm, a hurricane that crossed the Atlantic and crashed into the coast of southern England and Wales on the night of Friday, 26th November, 1703. I'm Sarah Churchwell. Welcome to Journey Through Time.
And I'm David Ulashoga, and this is the first of our 2 episodes on the Great Storm. Today we're going to talk about the night of the disaster itself, and then in the next episode we're going to explore the damage the storm left in its wake and how people at the time tried to make sense of this terrible disaster and how this calamity came to be forgotten. And the scale of the destruction does raise that question. How is this not a better known story? This is a catastrophe that killed at least 10,000 people, that destroyed or damaged hundreds of ships. In many ways, the level of destruction was comparable to that the nation endured in wars. And repeatedly, when people are describing what they saw in November 1703, they say it was like a bombardment. They describe cities that look like they have been bombed by enemy ships from the sea. And for a whole generation, the events of the Great Storm of 1703, that meant something in their life, the way that the Blitz meant something for a generation of people in Britain, what 9/11 means for modern New Yorkers. This was a disaster that hundreds of thousands, millions of people had witnessed, had experienced. They all had personal stories about what had happened that they took with them to the rest of their lives.
But we've forgotten all about it. I mean, the only reason I had ever even vaguely heard of it was because it comes into the story of a writer I much admire, Daniel Defoe, who we will be talking about in this episode. But it belongs on a scale with the Great Plague and the Great Fire, which certainly, I think almost everybody has heard of. And it's even got the same name, right? The Great Plague, the Great Fire, the Great Storm. And yet the Great Storm has completely fallen away from popular memory, as you're saying.
And that's exactly what makes it really strange, is that 40 years before the Great Storm of 1703, England went through 2 comparable disasters. There was the Great Plague, and then there was the Great Fire of London in 1666. And the strange thing is that both of those events are well remembered. They are part of British history. There is a monument to the Great Fire of London. The plague is encoded into nursery rhymes that I learnt at school as a child. And the people living in England in 1703, many of them had witnessed, had experienced the plague and the fire. Nobody who woke up on the morning of the 27th of November 1703 would have dreamed that this new disaster would somehow be forgotten in the way that the others two were not forgotten, that they were built into British history. And the other thing, when you put these three disasters beside one another, the plague, the fire and the storm kills far more people than the fire. Historians don't know exactly how many people died in the fire of London, but it's probably in single figures. One of the estimates is just 6 people died. The fire was slow moving. People could get out of its way. Now, many more people died in the plague, but the Great Storm killed at least 10,000 people. So one event that kills maybe 6 people has been remembered, and an event 40 years later that kills 10,000 people has been forgotten. So this is not an event that was not remembered because it was somehow inconsequential. It was more deadly than the Great Fire, and people at the time compared it to the Great Fire. So there is a big question about how events, why some are remembered and why are forgotten, but we'll come on to that later.
Yeah, so let's see if we can maybe offer some thoughts as to why it's been forgotten. But first, let's get to the storm itself. Now, as I said a minute ago, you can't really talk about the story of the Great Storm without talking about the writer most closely associated with it, who is Daniel Defoe, one of the great towering figures in English literature.
He's one of the most interesting, one of the strangest, and in some ways one of the most controversial figures in 18th century British history. He is sometimes called the Great Fabricator because although he is a great chronicler, he's also a great mythologizer. He mythologizes his own life. In 1703, the year of the storm, he's in his 40s. He's been a merchant who set up businesses. He's been a spy. He's been a rebel. He was going to go on, of course, to be one of the great pioneers of the English novel, the author, 16 years later, of Robinson Crusoe.
Well, and Robinson Crusoe is the story of surviving a great storm, right? It is the story of a shipwrecked man who survives on a desert island. And there are actually a lot of the elements of this story that come into Robinson Crusoe. And yeah, I think that you can't underestimate the importance of Defoe, not just in English literature, but in English history, because he is often called the father of the English novel, and Robinson Crusoe is really important. But he's also helped invent modern journalism, and that's where the story of the Great Storm comes in.
In 1703, he's best known as a pamphleteer. He's writing pamphlets in support of his political friends, and he's attacking his political enemies. And these pamphlets are in some ways like the sort of social media, the Twitter of the 18th century. And like social media, they're an easy way to get into trouble. And Defoe has had a really bad year in 1703. He began the year literally on the run. He's been under arrest, in hiding for 5 months. He was arrested in May and put on trial, charged with seditious libel. One of his pamphlets, one of his many pamphlets, had annoyed the wrong people. He's found guilty, fined £130 and made to stand in the pillory, which is a sort of a stock that people were put in and people could throw pelt stones or rocks or excrement at them. He comes out of that rather well because his friends protect him, but then he is sent to Newgate Prison, the most terrifying prison in London. And he gets out in early November because he had powerful friends, including Queen Anne, who paid his fine. While he was in prison, his business, a brick and roof tile company, went bust. But Defoe has this amazing ability to take a moment of disaster, of personal adversity, and turn it to his advantage. And so just after the storm, the week after, he puts an advert in the London Gazette, and he asks people around the country to send him their accounts of the storm that has just devastated the country. And he promises that they will be faithfully recorded and that he would put their names in the book he's going to write about the storm. He is becoming, or acting like, an historian. He promises to preserve the remembrance of this disaster.
But he also recognizes there, doesn't he, something quite consistent in human nature, which is that people like to see their names in print, right? So he knows how he's going to incentivize it. But basically, he's inventing crowdsourcing here, right? He's inventing crowdsourced journalism. And that's one of the things that's so remarkable about Defoe, is that he's constantly inventing, kind of new literary forms. But here he invents it through his telling of the story of the Great Storm. So it just adds to the reasons why the Great Storm is of such historic importance, because of the ways that it actually influences the way we would understand journalism and its relationship to history too.
That's exactly what he's doing. He's crowdsourcing. However, this is still a man known as the Great Fabricator, and he cannot resist increasing the level of drama. And throughout these 2 episodes, we're going to heavily rely on Defoe's account of the Great Storm. But we have to remember, this is a man with debts, a man with powerful enemies as well as powerful friends, a man who often needs to make money, and he is not prone to letting accuracy ever stand in the way of a great story.
Well, this is why he invents the novel, right? So we're bearing in mind that, yes, he's a great journalist and a really important one, but he's also a great novelist. So we can't tell the story without him, but we have to take it with a pretty big grain of salt.
Yeah. Just to set up for a moment, the England of 1703 that faces this disaster. It's a nation with a population of around 5 million. Queen Anne is on the throne, and as England almost always is, it is at war, this time the wars of Spanish succession. But England is already a great trading nation, and it is an imperial power with colonies in North America and the Caribbean and growing wealth coming from India. And that's in some ways why this storm is, to use the cliche, the perfect storm. Because everything for the power of England depends on the sea, the merchant ships and the warships of the Royal Navy. This is almost the worst possible disaster for a maritime nation. And it's a perfect storm in another way, is because, as we'll explain, repeatedly, events and circumstances conspire, accidental factors come together to make this storm more destructive and more deadly.
It's one of the things that, I think we're always interested in the stories that we tell, isn't it? Is about what, historians talk about, the contingency of history and the ways in which if just a few factors had been different, things might not have come out the way that they did. And as you say, the cliche of the perfect storm arises precisely because of moments like this, where in fact everything coincides to amplify the disaster, to make it as bad as it possibly could be.
Yeah. And this is for once when the perfect storm isn't just about the meteorology. It's not just the storm is a terribly devastating storm. All sorts of different things like the tides and the moons all conspire to make this a disaster. The weather gets bad 2 weeks before the night of the storm. There's high winds and there's rough seas. This is because what is going to become the great storm is already making its way across the Atlantic towards England. And the storm has an effect that is one of those accidental factors. It means that ships crossing the Atlantic from North America or the Caribbean make their journeys faster than normal. That means there are more ships in English ports on the night of the storm. But the storm also has the opposite effect, which is that the seas are so rough that ships that want to leave England and go off to the colonies remain in ports. Defoe says ships newly gone to sea were forced back so that the sea was swept clean of all shipping. So an extraordinarily, unusually high number of ships are in ports around the coast of England and Wales waiting for the storm to arrive. And then the final element in this build-up to disaster is just a matter of timing, of bad luck. The night of the storm, 26th of November, 1703, is a spring tide, which means the tides are exceptionally high, several feet above normal levels.
Several feet above normal levels means that it's, even today, that's an exceptionally high tide. That would be record levels.
Yeah, and Defoe, in his wonderful language, says that the tides were 6 or 8 foot higher than it was ever known to do in the memory of man.
6 or 8 feet above normal levels. And then there's the storm piling up.
The storm is heading across the Atlantic. The tides are higher than almost ever. And the final piece of this terrible jigsaw is the night of the storm is the night of a new moon. That means it was almost completely black. There is no moonlight. And so this calamity is going to take place, and you can read this in account after account, in near total darkness.
It must have really contributed to the horror of it as well, for living through it, for it to be, and obviously we're living, this is pre-electricity, obviously. So, to have absolutely no access to light and to be living through the terror of a hurricane smashing into England, and you don't even have any light to navigate. I mean, it's terrifying just to think about, and it was terrifying for them to go through it.
Absolutely. Defoe begins his account on the 24th of November, 2 nights before the storm. He is living in London, and he tells us that that night he narrowly escapes being killed or injured. He is making his way home, and a house in his neighbourhood is partially collapsed by what are already storm force winds. Not yet a hurricane, but storm force winds. Tiles are being ripped off the roofs, and it was dangerous to go outside. And Defoe does something very unusual for him. He does the sensible thing. He goes home to his house in Hackney, and he stays there with his wife Mary and their children for the next few days. A rare occasion of Defoe doing what was actually in his interests.
Well, he's not going to become the great novelist of survivalism unless he can figure out how to survive. So at least he's got something in his favor here.
He then next tells us, and see, you can already see it is impossible to tell this story without Defoe because he is the great chronicler of it. On the afternoon of the 26th, the night of the storm, there is a sudden drop in pressure. And repeatedly in accounts of this night, people with barometers that record atmospheric pressure, they write in their diaries of there being an exceptionally rapid fall in pressure, that the mercury in the barometer drops to levels never seen before. Defoe says at 10 o'clock on the evening of the 26th, our barometers informed us that the night would be very tempestuous. The mercury sunk lower than ever I had observed on any occasion whatsoever. In fact, this is such a freak reading that Defoe does the thing that sort of any parent does if a piece of technology in your house isn't working. You blame the children. He wrote that it made me suppose the tube had been handled and disturbed by the children. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, so he presumed that the kids had been messing around with it.
I mean, you say it is classic. Some things never change, but it's really cinematic, isn't it? I mean, you can imagine the camera suddenly zooming in on the barometer dropping, right? And he's giving us these portentous details that build, and even with just you narrating it, you really feel the suspense building where you go, it's just another factor and another factor. And you can imagine the camera panning from the high tides to the dropping barometer. And then that little moment of comedy of him blaming the kids. But in a disaster movie, it's not the kids, the disaster is coming.
Yeah. The feeling people must have had when they saw this one measurement they have, this one piece of technology that tells them about the weather, long before meteorological science we have today. But they do have barometers. And this is a freak reading. This is not normal. This is terrifying.
We've been referring to it as a hurricane, but that's not the language that Defoe uses, or not in any consistent way, is it? I mean, they're using 18th century words like tempest and storm.
Yeah.
Was it actually a hurricane?
Well, they use these words interchangeably. They use tempest, storm, hurricane without the technical definitions that we have today. Today, because of meteorological science, a hurricane has a definition. It's a tropical cyclone with wind speeds above force 12. That didn't mean a damn thing in 1703. And scientists have spent the past 3 centuries looking back at all of the evidence, including Defoe's book, trying to understand what happened. What we think happened was that a hurricane from the Caribbean managed somehow to cross the Atlantic without losing its power. Now, hurricanes often cross the Atlantic, but by the time they get to England, they're just a bad storm. They knock over some trees, they might break a few windows, they're a minor local news story. They're not a national disaster, but this storm, for reasons no one really understands, made it across the Atlantic without losing its power. That's why it was so deadly. So it was, we think, a hurricane, but it's very late in the year for a tropical hurricane.
That's the other thing, right? I was going to say, I mean, because, I grew up in the U.S., obviously, and we do have hurricanes there. But late November is really, really late for a hurricane. And it's particularly late then, isn't it? Because, our seas have warmed so much that has changed, the storm patterns. But in 1703, the seas were a lot cooler. So for a hurricane to maintain that kind of force and make it all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and still smack into England with hurricane force winds, that really is a freak occurrence.
Yeah, I think that shows why for 3 centuries meteorologists have been trying to debate this, because not all of the pieces of evidence fall into place. It is still a question that is debated. How could this have happened?
So at this point, it seems like maybe we'll never know for sure. So we're going to assume it's a hurricane, but it's possible that it isn't.
I think so.
Okay. Well, we're not meteorologists, so
Sorry,
we'll go with the consensus.
Yeah, we're slipping into science here, Sarah, where both of us will flounder.
But I'm sure the experts, we'll have experts listening who can weigh in. So
Or
send in
argue
on
amongst
postcards.
themselves, like most experts. On the night of the storm, to go back to our great central narrator, Daniel Defoe, he is in what he calls a well-built brick house on the outskirts of the city of London. And during the night, he tells us, the fury of the tempest increased to such a degree that most people expected the fall of their houses. Bricks and tiles and stones from the tops of houses flew with such force, he says, and so thick in the streets that no one thought fit to venture out, though their houses were near demolished. I mean, that's slightly lost in the 18th century language, but people are in this dilemma that if you go out, you might get cut to bits by roof tiles that are flying through the air, but if you stay in your house, it might collapse on you.
I was struck as I was reading this that he also says that he saw tiles hurled with such force from the roofs that they stuck several inches into the ground, which is just an incredible image. And as you say, the 18th century language can be a little bit obfuscating, but when you get something that vivid, you think, oh my God, it was hurling roof tiles with sufficient force that the winds drove them into the ground. And, even today, that would be absolutely, again, it's terrifying.
Yeah. Now, Defoe is describing the situation in London, and by the time the storm hits the capital, there's already been a calamity because, of course, the storm is coming from the Caribbean, it's travelling east, and the first place it hits is the far west of England. And the town that is the first to be devastated is Bristol, which is where I'm talking to you from today. Bristol was then the country's second most important port. And again, this perfect storm metaphor is the right metaphor because, again, circumstances had come together to make the effect of the storm even worse. Heavy rain for 2 weeks meant the ground was saturated. The rivers were already full. And that meant when the storm hit, a tide was driven up the River Avon and there was disastrous flooding in Bristol. But remember, a moment ago we were talking about how ships had been pushed across the Atlantic more rapidly than usual by the force of the storm. Well, many of those ships had been heading to Bristol, the country's second port, a centre of the colonial trade, and that meant there were more ships than normal in the harbour and there was more produce, more goods from the colonies in the warehouses of Bristol. One historian of the city said that no one had ever known a greater quantity of sugar and tobacco accumulated in the city than on the night of the storm.
So there is this huge amount of merchandise that is stockpiled, and when the storm hits, does it end up like floating in the streets, doesn't it?
There is a financial disaster for the city of Bristol because so much produce, so much wealth is accumulated in the city because all of those ships being pushed forward by the storm that 1,500 barrels of sugar and tobacco are spoilt or destroyed because of the flooding that sweeps through the city, sweeps through the warehouses. And it's estimated that £100,000 worth of goods were destroyed on the night of the storm.
Which, of course, today would be many millions worth
That's right.
of goods. So it's like a shipwreck. I mean, you can picture all the floating barrels, but it's on land.
Yeah. And it's a financial calamity for the merchants of Bristol. However, this is where I'm going to struggle with the powers of empathy because these goods, sugar and tobacco, are of course produced by enslaved people in Virginia and the Caribbean. So the merchants of Bristol are not people I find it desperately easy to have a great deal of sympathy for. But there's lots of other people who are affected. Farmers in the land around Bristol. Many people die. Thousands of sheep are drowned. The land is poisoned by salt. So in all sorts of ways, what happens in the West Country is a portent of what is going to happen to the rest of the country as this storm sweeps across the south and the Midlands, all the way across Wales towards Defoe in London.
So, as you're saying, there's a human cost, but there is also a tremendous economic cost, and it's not only hitting the affluent, the people who are, making money from, colonies of enslavement, but actually, everybody is being devastated by this. I mean, one of the details there that you just mentioned, almost in passing, is about the land being salted. And it's something that I had never thought about, but that if you get that kind of flooding from seawater, that actually it's going to destroy the land. The recovery is going to take decades then if the land has been salted.
It will destroy your crops. It will mean that animals can't graze. And, this is the early 18th century. The vast majority of people are just on what we today call the poverty line. People are just about making it for the most part. So this is a calamity that's, as I said, I'm struggling to feel sorry for the rich merchants of Bristol. But for many people, they're going to really suffer. As in all of these disasters, the poor are the people who suffer most. And that's what we're going to see as this storm rips across the country.
So we've been talking in kind of general terms, but one of the things that Defoe does so well is he brings the story to life through these crowdsourced stories about individuals. So there's one I read in your notes that I really liked about a widow who is trying to leave her house, but the storm actually works against that.
So Defoe tells us about a woman living in Wiltshire, again in the west of England, a widow living alone. And she is so convinced on the night of the storm that her house is about to collapse down upon her that she rushes to the door to get out. But the wind is so strong that she literally cannot open her door. Defoe says she fears that every gust of wind would have buried her in the ruins, and so she has no choice but to sit in her house and see what happens. And Defoe is pleased to tell the readers of his book, The Great Storm, that the widow and the house do survive.
He does love a survival story. I mean, Defoe's big thing is ordinary people making it against the odds. So here he is with an early version of that. It is remarkable, though, the way in which the wind is, saving her against her own, desire. So maybe what we should do is take a break there on that small moment of hope. And having looked at the storm's devastating effects on land, we're now going to hear about its really cataclysmic impact on sea. Welcome back to Journey Through Time. We're discussing the Great Storm of 1703. Before the break, we were talking about the impact of the storm as it crashed into the coast of England. But it was also, as we were saying, a time when hundreds of ships were sheltering in the country's ports.
That's right. This in many ways was the perfect storm because more ships had been pushed across the Atlantic into English ports and many other ships had been unable to leave and set off for their journeys. So although many of the accounts inevitably describe the deaths on land, most of the deaths of the Great Storm take place off the coast, on ships, in harbours, in rivers, in the English Channel. One of the first ports to be hit is Milford Haven in the far west of Wales, and accounts of what it was like being in that harbour on that night are descriptions of hell. And this is in part not just because of the storm, it's because it is completely dark. The harbour is full of ships and they are desperately trying to not crash into one another and not crash into the harbour walls itself. They are firing their cannons in a desperate attempt to have a flash of light so other ships can see where they are. And this nightmare is going to be repeated in port after port across the English and Welsh coasts. One of the ironies of the Great Storm is that one of the buildings, if we can call it that was destroyed, that was most famously destroyed, was a building dedicated to safety at sea, the Eddystone Lighthouse. 9 miles off the coast of Cornwall are a group of jagged rocks called the Eddystone Rocks, and on there, on the night of the Great Storm, there stood a lighthouse. And the story of the lighthouse is a very strange story about a very strange man called Henry Winstanley. And like Defoe, his story is intimately intertwined with the story of the Great Storm. The Eddystone Rocks were such a danger to shipping because they were on the route to Plymouth, one of the great ports and one of the great dockyards of the Royal Navy, and they were infamous for sinking ships. And 2 of the ships that they had claimed in the 17th century had belonged to an English merchant and inventor, Henry Winstanley. And he decided not just to accept this loss of shipping and this loss of his wealth, but to do something quite remarkable that no one else had ever attempted, which is to build a lighthouse, not on the coast, but on rocks out to sea.
So you said they're 9 miles out to sea. So this is in the sea. I mean, it's in the ocean, fully exposed to the waves, and you've got no modern equipment. You've got no engines, you've got no cranes, you've got no oxygen and diving gear. How do you go out 9 miles to sea and build a lighthouse?
Yeah, lighthouses are ancient, of course. They've been built for centuries, for millennia, but no one had ever tried to build them on rocks out in the sea.
Well, you could see why.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges, and it made the situation is made more complicated by the fact that Henry Winstanley, remarkable guy, but he had no formal training in architecture, and yet he took on this task. He started building a lighthouse in 1696, so 7 years before the storm. During the building of the lighthouse, a French privateer attacked the unfinished lighthouse, took Winstanley prisoner, and he was released on the orders of Louis XIV, even though England and France were at war. Louis XIV is said to have said that Winstanley should be released because France was at war with England, not with humanity. He was somebody who was seen as doing something in the service of humanity, trying to see if rocks at sea could be marked with lighthouses.
He's really a larger-than-life character, isn't he? I mean, to be saved on the orders of the King of France himself. I mean, it feels that Winstanley should be a character in a Defoe novel, but Defoe didn't actually write about Winstanley. He should have done, though.
No, but Defoe knew about him because he was famous. Everyone knew about him. In 1698, he had built his first lighthouse. It was largely made of wood, 120 feet high, out on these rocks in the English Channel. It was not strong enough, and Winstanley's detractors said it wouldn't survive a bad storm. It was rebuilt, it was strengthened, but Winstanley decided that he wanted to witness what it was like to be inside the lighthouse during a storm so that he could work out how to make it even stronger. The legend has it that on the 24th of November, so 2 days before the storm, the day Defoe is in London being almost killed by falling tiles and masonry in London, that Winstanley took a supply ship out to his lighthouse. He was warned by local fishermen not to go, that it was too dangerous. But he is said to have said, this may be a legend, but it's a great legend if it is, that he wanted to be in the lighthouse during the greatest storm that ever blew under the face of the heavens. And on that night of the storm, he got his wish.
If it's a legend, it's a great legend. We're not going to let facts get in the way of a good story occasionally either. We don't know. It could be true. But also, part of what makes it sound so legendary is that I'm always getting my literary hat on, but that's classic hubris, right? That's pride going before the fall, defying the gods, daring them, daring the storm to take you. And as you say, he lost his bet.
Yeah. What we know is that the glass lantern at the top of the lighthouse, from which the light emanated, was broken. The wooden supporting beams gave way, and Winstanley and 5 other men who were in the lighthouse all died. Winstanley's body was never found. Now, the irony is that 2 days later, on the 28th of November, a ship called the Winchelsea, carrying tobacco from Virginia that had already been damaged by the storm in the Atlantic, was limping towards the English coast. It approached the Eddystone Rocks, and now there was no lighthouse there. There had been a lighthouse there for the previous 5 years. They were expecting to see a lighthouse. They presumed they were in no danger because they couldn't see light from the lighthouse. The ship struck the Eddystone Rocks, and only 6 out of the crew of 28 survived. And it was the first ship to hit the Eddystone Rocks for 5 years because of the lighthouse.
So it is another, we keep talking about this as a perfect storm. It's not a metaphor. It's literally true. Just factor after factor conspires to make sure that the devastation is, at its highest.
Yeah, and the irony upon irony that one of the great structures destroyed is a structure designed to improve safety at sea. Defoe wrote about the loss of the Eddystone Lighthouse, and he said it was doubtful that it will ever be attempted again. He saw this loss of Winstanley as well as a tragedy, this hero who had pioneered this new type of building, this remarkable structure that for 5 years had saved lives. Now, Defoe was actually wrong about that. There were later lighthouses built. There is one there today. It is operated remotely, so nobody has to sit in that lighthouse during storms. But it shows that Winstanley was right all along. This was a desperately needed structure that after his death, after his first lighthouse, the people did repeat it and did build a new lighthouse.
So we've been talking about Defoe's account of the Great Storm. We've been relying on it heavily. And it came out really quickly, didn't it? It is much more like journalism than like history in that regard, in that he got it out fast and said, we've all just lived through this thing, and I want to tell you the story of the storm and its impact across the country.
Absolutely. To even begin to tell this story, we've already had to heavily rely on Defoe's book, but we should give it a title. It's called The Storm, or a collection of the most remarkable casualties and disasters which happened in the late dreadful tempest, both by sea and land. It was published just 8 months after the storm. And that title, that's what passes for a short, snappy title in the early 18th century.
As you say, it is typical of 18th century titles, but it isn't just that they're long-winded, right? They're blurbs and they're marketing. So the title is, it's selling the book. So he's letting you know everything that's in the book in the title.
Defoe's book is the definitive book, but there are lots of other pamphlets. This is the age of pamphlets that also appeared in 1704 around the same time, and they tend to have more typically ridiculously long 18th century titles. So if you can indulge me, my favourite of them is entitled An Exact Relation of the Late Dreadful Tempest, or, and you always know it's going to get even longer when you have an or in the middle of it,
Wait for it.
A faithful account of the most remarkable disasters which happened on that occasion, the places where and the persons who suffered by the same in city and country, the number of ships, men and guns that were lost, the miraculous escapes of several persons from dangers of the calamity both by land and sea, faithfully collected by an ingenious hand to preserve the memory of so terrible a judgment. This is an anonymous pamphlet with a great big rambling title, written anonymously by somebody who describes themselves rather immodestly as the ingenious hand.
It's great. I mean, the title's almost longer than the pamphlet.
And the second of these little books or pamphlets that, again, we're going to use to tell the rest of this story is called A Wonderful History of All the Storms, Hurricanes and, for some reason, Earthquakes that have happened in England for above 500 years past. And this book, the author says, has a particular and large account of the dreadful storm that happened on the 26th and 27th of November 1703. So this is a pamphlet that puts the events of the Great Storm in the context of previous storms. So he's slightly padding out this account with bits of history books that he's copied about other storms.
And of course, this isn't just altruism or trying to share information. I mean, this is entrepreneurial. They're all trying to make a buck. It's a really exciting story. And as you say, can we pad it out? Can we find some earthquakes and add some things to it? And then, maybe people will buy, your account instead of Defoe's.
These are pamphlets that people want to buy because we've just been through this collective experience in England, and people want to know what happened in other towns, what happened to other people. Were their memories like those that were recorded by these pamphleteers and by Daniel Defoe? Now, all of these pamphlets that we've mentioned and Defoe's book were published in London, and there is a sort of metropolitan bias built into them. But this is a country of 5 million, 500,000 people live in London, and so it is by far the biggest city, and so the details of what happens in London are the most vivid that we have. These pamphlets and Defoe tell us, for example, that the Queen Anne, had to be taken to a place of safety in St James's Palace when the chimneys looked like they might collapse, and before being rushed to safety, the Queen is said to have stood at a window watching the trees of St James's Park being literally ripped out of the ground. And then there's accounts of what happens to individuals, a family in Golden Square whose home collapses upon them, but somehow, miraculously, are taken from the rubble unharmed. When you read these accounts of all of this damage and destruction in London, it's important to remember one thing. We mentioned earlier about the Great Fire. This city has just been rebuilt. Just 40 years earlier, the city had been burnt to the ground. So this is a new city. These are new buildings in many cases. And of course, people in their 50s and 60s, they've witnessed that earlier disaster. This is the second time they've seen London being ripped apart, being devastated.
It does make sense of it, doesn't it? That, we were saying earlier that the Great Fire and the Great Storm have these, parallel titles because people experience them in parallel ways. It was like, well, we had the Great Plague, we had the Great Fire, and oh my God, here comes the Great Storm. And you kind of can't believe that it's happening again. And yet there's this devastation all around you, and you're going to have to pick up the pieces all over again.
Yeah. The irony of having just rebuilt the capital city after the Great Fire, and then this new disaster, this fresh hell arrives and devastates these new buildings. I mean, that's just it's just appalling. But despite all of this damage to buildings, to palaces, the worst place to be again is on board a ship. And that night, there are hundreds of ships in the Thames, because this is a time before the canals, when roads are just muddy tracks, and the only effective form of transportation is by sea. And London is this mega city that is fueled, that is kept alive by coal and building materials and food and beer pouring into the capital on ships on the Thames.
Today, when we look at the Thames, we see at most a few kind of ferries, a few pleasure cruisers. There's very little actually activity on the water, but we have to be picturing a very different Thames, don't we? We have to be picturing a river that is crammed with ships.
Yeah. The Thames is a motorway. It is the biggest thoroughfare in the country. It's also a river in which there are not many docks, so ships are anchored in the river. They're extremely vulnerable. This is one of the busiest waterways in the world, fueling and feeding a city that is going through a consumer boom. And that night, the worst possible place, the most dangerous possible place you could be, is on the Thames in one of those ships. And inevitably, it is again Daniel Defoe who describes best and most vividly what happened to those ships. Because on the 3rd of December, so a week after the Great Storm, he goes down to the river and he describes the scene. He paints a picture. He tells us that on the Thames, that there lay a few less than 700 ships. Some lay with their sterns tossed up so high that the tide flowed into their forecastles. Some lay leaning upon others, the number of masts split and broken. But there was hardly, he says, a vessel to be seen that had not suffered some damage.
You said it's like a motorway, and it's so, again, we have the cinematic image, right, of a pileup on the motorway of cars flipped every which way, and some vertical and some, spun over. And it is like that, but with ships, that they're all just piled up and smashed into each other. And that, again, this kind of very cinematic scene of the aftermath of devastation.
Yeah, it's absolute chaos. They've been pushed along the river. Some have crashed into the old London Bridge, that amazing structure that had houses on it. Some were gathered together in corners where the wind had pushed them. But this was devastation. There was loss of life, and there was also huge loss of goods and, of course, of ships.
So that gives us some sense of the impact on London. But of course, London was not the hardest hit part of the country by any means, was it?
London is the best recorded. That's where the pamphlets were written. That's where Defoe is living. But the death toll is highest around the coast. Defoe gives a slightly lower death toll for the whole nation than many others. He estimates around 8,000 people died on the night of the Great Storm.
And that's a low estimate, 8,000 people.
That's the lowest, yeah. Historians have suggested maybe 30,000 people. The consensus seems to be around 10,000 to maybe 15,000 people died as a result of the Great Storm. And just to remind us again, that is far more than the Great Fire of 40 years earlier, and yet we are talking about an event that's been largely forgotten. Most of the people who die and most of the ships damaged are, of course, merchant ships, because merchant ships are the biggest fleets, bigger than any navy. But the Royal Navy is extremely badly hit, because also trapped in Britain's ports, also being pushed across the Atlantic, are the warships of the Royal Navy. The Navy loses on the night of the storm 13 ships, which includes the entire Channel Squadron. And of that, maybe 10,000, maybe 15,000 people who die, 1,600 of them are sailors of the Royal Navy, and by some calculations, that is 10% of the strength of the Navy as it stood in 1703.
Defoe says it's 1 in 5, right? That it's 20%.
Defoe has a higher estimate, yeah.
Yeah. So again, we've got estimates. We're trying to figure out, what, but again, you get whatever the correct number is. It's staggering.
It is. And you can sense in the pamphlets and the reports that this is regarded as a strategic concern. It's not just about the loss of ships, it's about the loss of naval power. Remember, England is at war, the wars of Spanish succession. And so there is a concern that you can read in the pamphlets that these are the ships that defend Britain. These are the first line of defence. They don't just defend trade, they are what allows Britain to build its empire, to control the seas, to keep its enemies at bay. So this is not just about loss of life, although that is a tragedy, and all the pamphlets lament the loss of life. It is also a fear that this leaves the nation vulnerable.
So the nation is being made vulnerable on multiple levels, right, as you say. So it's not just the loss of life, but then we've been talking about how it's an economic disaster, so the loss of many, many people's livelihoods, and it's a national security crisis.
It is. This is one of the worst days in the history of the Royal Navy. The statistic and the comparison that I think is interesting here is that on the night of the Great Storm, the Royal Navy loses 13 ships. At the Battle of Trafalgar, when the British take on the combined fleets of France and Spain, the Royal Navy loses no ships. This is one of the worst events in the history of the Royal Navy. It's not a battle, it's not part of a war, it is a climatic disaster, a meteorological disaster that somehow isn't part of our national story, isn't something that people remember as being comparable to the Great Fire or the Great Plague. Crazy that that's happened.
So I think we need to end it there for today, but next time we're going to see how, in fact, the devastation continues. And we'll also see how people at the time tried desperately to make sense of it, asking, is it the wrath of God? How can they understand the apocalypse that had just struck them? So join us for that next week on Journey Through Time.
Thanks for listening. See you next week.